Did you guys ever make a big mistake? I know I've made several in my life. That's the one problem when you plant a church that you still pastor. Every time there's a problem, I look and I go, yeah, I made that problem. But I didn't start making mistakes when I was a pastor. I remember one of them I made in high school. My partner and I, in chemistry class, had finished our assignment early, right, in the lab, and it involved the use of a Bunsen burner. And teenage boys and fire, I don't know. I don't think that's a good combination. So we were just kind of sitting there at the table. I can still picture the moment, and we were waiting, and my bored self kind of wondered, a question came up in my mind. I'm like, I wonder how hot that flame is on the Bunsen burner, right? And then I looked on my table, and there's a thermometer. Whoops. Yeah, right, Doug? So I look at the thermometer, I look at the flame, and I don't know, Gina. It wasn't my brightest moment. But I wanted to know, how hot that flame was. So, yeah, I did it. I took that thermometer, and I stuck it in the middle of the flame of that Bunsen burner. Any chemistry teachers in the room? Do you know what happened next, right? I watched as the mercury, yes, it was mercury, which is a dangerous substance, went up and up and up and up and up all the way to the top, and boom, burst the top of that glass thermometer. Not my brightest moment of high school. I have to tell you, somehow I still passed the chemistry class. I'm not sure how, because I made this huge mess, and the teacher was not happy. But it was a perfect illustration I could use with my boys as I was raising them and teaching them about tools. And I'd always tell them, look, you've got to use a tool in the proper way. If you use something in a way it's not meant to be used, you won't get the desired results, and you might even do damage. And so I taught them that growing up, and then I realized something. We've done that with preaching and discipleship. We've done that, Debbie, with preaching and discipleship. Now, don't get me wrong, preaching's great. I love to preach. I love to listen to a good message, just like thermometers are great, but they have their purpose. You can inspire with preaching. You could see people get saved with preaching, which is amazing, all kinds of good stuff. But what you can't do is disciple with preaching. It won't work. Now, think about it this way. Let me illustrate. If preaching made fully formed disciples of Jesus Christ, the Great Commission would be done. Right? Think about it. Think of all the sermons and all the pulpits and all the TV stations and all the radio stations and all the internet that goes out around the world. And let's face it, after COVID, all of you are YouTube personalities, right? With so much preaching, how are we losing ground in the United States? If that made disciples, what's the problem? And the problem is it's just not the right tool to make disciples. They could do a lot of good things, but it can't do that. Now think of it this way. Jesus didn't use it that way. Sure, he preached. I'm not saying he didn't. He absolutely did, but he didn't make disciples preaching. Now during COVID, when it hit, I really started to think about this. How did Jesus make disciples, and how was I making disciples? And I didn't like thinking about that, Gina, because I saw that they were completely different ways. And to be honest, things exploded and got a little messy in early 2020. You remember that? And I began to wonder, was I using the wrong tool? And so I really looked at Jesus, and I noticed a couple things. First off, Jesus was incredibly intentional about making disciples. He drove the process. He picked certain people, just a few really, to be close to him. He spent time with them, he trained them, he mentored them, and he did it all with the purpose of making them into disciple makers. Do you know that sometimes Jesus even left the crowd to spend time with fewer people? We know better than to do that. But Jesus did that. We think sometimes, give us the crowds, the American way, bigger is better, more is better, right? Jesus had the vision to think small. Disciple making was really a huge part of why he'd come, a big part. In John chapter 17, such a great passage, in verses 4-9, Jesus is praying to God, and he says to God these words, I have brought you glory on earth by completing the work you gave me to do. Now, have you ever asked yourself the question, what's he talking about? What work did he finish? He hasn't been to the cross yet. He hasn't risen from the dead yet. What's he talking about? What work is it that God gave him to do that he had completed? Was it the miracles? Was it the mass crowds and gatherings and teaching events? No. Jesus said these words to God, his Father, in the context of being in the upper room with his closest disciples. And he talks to God about them in that chapter. And he says, I have revealed you to those whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me, and they've obeyed your word. For I gave them the words you gave me, and they accepted them. They knew with certainty that I came from you, and they believed that you sent me. So what was the work he completed? Making disciples. Getting them ready for the mission. Now, they're not perfect, right? We know that from reading the stories. The empowerment of the Spirit is yet to come, but Jesus has got them where they're ready to take on the mission. And that's the point of discipleship. Now Jesus is ready to go to the garden and to the cross, which comes after John 17, because this part of his work, the part of making disciples, is done. He was intentional. If I was honest in early 2020, we were not very intentional about making disciples. If we made disciples, it was kind of an accident. But it wasn't the way Jesus did it. Most church plans actually are exactly what we were doing at the time. Go to a lot of church services, go to a lot of church gatherings. That's what I had seen, and that's what I had experienced. That's what most American churches are like. In fact, they did a survey in early 2020 that said that 70% of U.S. churches have absolutely no plans to make disciples. So that's the strategy of 70% of U.S. churches. We're not intentional, we're more accidental. And then Jesus was relational. I mean, he made disciples in a relationship environment. John 1, right, says the word became flesh and dwelt among us. He lived among those he was discipling. And then here's our second mistake. We're not relational when we make disciples. We're just informational. If we do discipleship in our church, if we do it, it's more like a class. Hey, read this book, fill out these blanks, attend this new beginner's class for 8 weeks, and now you're a disciple. Really? Look, if it was just a matter of information we needed, God could have just given us a discipleship download. But the word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. God gave the 12 disciples his son, not a website. People don't need manuals as much as they need men and women of flesh who will show them in real life what it means to walk with Jesus. And that's the vehicle that we need to make disciples, relationships. And that's our second mistake. We don't do it that way. Here's our third mistake. Whatever we might have, it's not aimed at multiplication. 70% of U.S. churches have absolutely no plan to make disciples. 25% of them have a plan, but it's only a plan by addition. And the truth is, when you dig down a little bit, so few Christians are actually doing it, and those that are doing it are only doing it by addition. That won't fulfill the Great Commission. Did you know that over 90% of American Christians won't lead one single person to Jesus Christ in their entire lifetime? Like, how are we supposed to do this if 90% of the people in our churches don't lead someone to Jesus? That doesn't sound like a disciple life, does it? You know, when you're mature, you reproduce, don't you? Right? By the way, Jesus didn't practice discipleship by addition. He practiced multiplication. He made disciples who made disciples. And only less than 5% of U.S. churches actually do that. Now, part of the relational bit is being up close and personal. He wasn't distant behind a lectern. He spent 3.5 years pouring into 12 people who he called to go out and make their own disciples. And sometimes, like I said, he left the crowd just to be with those people. If it was us, I'm sad to say we would probably spend 3.5 years doing mass crusades. But that's not what Jesus did to make disciples. And that's another part of our problem. We often are not willing to make the time commitment investment in small commodities to make disciples who make disciples. we honestly don't do what Paul called Timothy to do that we heard about last night. One of the things in 2 Timothy was to entrust these truths to reliable people who will be able to teach others also. That's multiplication. And that's a game changer. Jesus-style discipleship is intentional, relational, based in multiplication, and it's slow roasted. Now, I talked about this a couple of years ago, so I want to talk about, this is supposed to be a story, right, of what's happened, so I want to share that. And the best way is like to kind of tell you the stories of some people whose lives were changed because we tried to start experimenting with Jesus-style discipleship. So I want to first introduce you to Sarah. Sarah, sat in church for a number of years. Her family was in church for a number of years, but she was never really activated as really much of a follower of Jesus. So let's let Sarah tell her story.
When I was born, doctors told my parents that I probably wouldn't live very long, and that if I did, I wouldn't be really able to do anything for myself. Even simple things like sitting up and feeding myself, they said I wouldn't be able to do. I started to push God away as I got older because I was scared. I didn't think I was good enough to carry out the plans that He had for me. As I grew up and when I was a teenager, I started to develop really bad anxiety. It got to such a bad place that I was having panic attacks every day, pretty much. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't handle it anymore. Then I was asked to be a part of a discipleship microgroup here at Evangel, and that has made a drastic difference in my life. I started spending more time in the Bible and praying, and it has made such a difference in my life. At the end of January, I attended a discipleship training weekend seminar that Pastor Brian put on. And that weekend, God really got a hold of me. Something Pastor Brian said that weekend really made me change my outlook on life and on a lot of things. If you don't feel like you can do this, if you feel like you're not good enough, you're exactly the type of person God wants to use. You can't do this. That's true. But God can do it through you. So that day, I finally let go, and I said, God, I know you can do things through me, so I'm asking you to do that. And He has. He really has. There's a quote that I like that says, God doesn't need your ability, He needs your availability. So I'm finally ready to stop running from God and to make myself available to Him and start running to Him instead of from Him.
Let me tell you about Sarah. We got the chance to baptize Sarah, which is amazing. I mean, she was raised in church, but never wanted to make that kind of a public commitment. She attended that group she talked about. She has run and facilitated her own microgroup where she's discipled women. She's doing it again. She now works at the Springfield Rescue Mission, where she helps people struggling with chemical addictions. And you have to know Sarah to know what a mind-changing explosion, whatever this is. She leads devotions at the Springfield Rescue Mission that she writes herself. She's an amazing writer, and she's studying to be a coach so that she can come alongside of people with addictions and help them move forward in life. All of that is the process of discipleship. Sarah is a disciple who's making disciples, which is absolutely outstanding. Now let me introduce you to Nancy. Nancy came to our church as a Mormon, and we had a lot of discussions with Nancy, obviously, about the gospel. And she came to Christ, and she is one of the most pure, hearted, simple people in the best possible way you could ever imagine. But Nancy is now living the life as a disciple who makes disciples. So let's meet Nancy.
We lived for 10 years. Jim and I lived in a two-family house, and he lived on the bottom. We lived on the second floor. So just check on him a lot because he didn't have a lot of company or anything. And I used to talk with him. I tried to help him with his medicine. Then we moved out, and then I saw they had an estate sale at his house, and then I knew that something was wrong. So I went there, talked to his family, and he was in the nursing home on hospice care for failure to thrive. I went and saw him, and he both of us like ice in our drinks, and in the nursing home, that's all he wouldn't eat, but he would drink something with ice. and they didn't have time to bring him ice every day. So I would bring a big tumbler of ice every day and fill up his water and feed him some water. And he really liked that. I was worried that he hadn't said the prayer of salvation. I was waiting for the right moment. And that's when I was asking you, how do you say that? How do you say that? Because I didn't know, I've never said that with anybody before. And then when I asked him, I said, do you want me to say your regular prayer, or do you want me to say the prayer of salvation with you? And he said, and I heard it clear as day, he said, say it quick, I don't have long. And I was glad because he went downhill like the next day. This is all, I think, because of my discipleship group I was in. During that time, my relationship with God grew really strong. I realized I got head knowledge down to my heart knowledge that God really does love you, and he'll never love you any more or less than he does now. And I can hear from him clearly now, and I never used to, and I try to obey now, and then I have the group of girls that I was with, which were amazing.
Let me tell you about Nancy. Not only did she win that person to Christ, but this just happened after we interviewed that. She goes, I want to disciple ladies too. She said, and you know who God's leading on my heart? The non-Christian women in my neighborhood. So that's who she's reaching out to. So Nancy's going to be gathering with non-Christians in her neighborhood to lead them to Jesus and lead them to become disciples of Jesus. That's awesome. Now let me introduce you to Mike. I know Mike really well because Mike's in my microgroup, and I've spent about 18 months with Mike. And a group of 4 of us have taken this journey together. And so I've gotten to watch Mike close at hand. And I have to tell you about Mike. Before he was in the group, he was very much on the periphery of the church. Honestly, he'd be there some Sundays, never was involved in anything, never did anything, was afraid of getting close. But Mike, well, let me let you tell you his story. So, and then
I know that in the micro group that there was going to be. I knew me, and I knew me that I'm the kind of person that would try to escape, get out of the system of doing things, and kind of complacent about life and things. So I remember telling the micro group, don't let me out. Whatever happens, don't make me accountable. Lo and behold, maybe 3 weeks later, a month later, I get the news from my daughter. She said, Dad, Keen's dead. I said, what? I don't have the words to say what that feels like. There was a domestic issue on the street they lived on. My son was outside, and I guess the lady of the domestic went up to my son and made a comment to him. And I guess the guy that was causing the domestic with his girlfriend seen him talking to my son. They said there was videotape of it, other people seen it, that he hit my son in the head with something, rendered him unconscious, and then stepped on his head twice. Okay. About 3 weeks after, I felt the Spirit of God say to me in my heart, you gotta forgive him. At that moment, I said, I have to let this go, because the pain was more than I ever thought I could ever feel. The pain was so unbearable. And a feeling of lost and anger and confused. And I said, God, I need you. And I just prayed and prayed and prayed. And he delivered. He delivered. Once I said, I forgive him, I felt, I won't say better, but I felt like I could at least accept that this was real. But what I knew when I started praying to God about forgiveness, and God, please forgive him. And forgive me for what I feel and what I think right now, the things I want to say and do. And he did. He just slowly started mending me.
Yeah, we as a group walked Mike through that situation of his son being murdered and what that was like. And I've seen this transformation in Mike that's just absolutely amazing. And he would tell you this if he was here. He'd say there's 2 things that got him through that experience. One is Jesus. The other was his discipleship group. The 3 of us that hung with him and walked with him and lived this with him. And that's how we got through. Mike today has moved from being the periphery to he's one of our MCs at church. In fact, he leads the congregation in prayer. And not only that, but God is using him in his workplace as a light to shine because they know this story. And so now, like, he's telling people about Jesus at work. In fact, one guy named Brandon came to Christ, came to the church, accepted Christ, is now a member of our church specifically because of Mike. And Mike, I honestly believe, is going to be running his next microgroup at his workplace. Because so many people, non-Christians, are like, how did you make it through this? And he's got a story. And now he has a method he could use to reach people, to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Mike's a disciple who's making disciples. So intentional, relational, based in multiplication, slow roasted, and life-changing. It's a true fire that doesn't make a mess. You know, Galatians chapter 5 and verse 25 in English says, we live by the Spirit, so keep in step with the Spirit. And, you know, in Greek, it's really interesting because it's more like, since we have life in the Spirit, keep in step. And that keep in step in Greek is actually a military term. My youngest son just finished boot camp at AIT, so I'm very familiar with this part, watching him go through it. But what it means literally is march in a line, like that order, like that you're marching in a line, that you're disciplined, that you're moving forward in a direction. And so that's discipleship. Discipleship is just intentionally doing things in our life so that we put ourselves in line with God, so that his Spirit can fill us and use us. Discipleship and the Spirit infilling they're not two separate things, they go together. We stay in line so that the Spirit can fill us and then use us on mission to make disciples who make disciples. So in what you do, how can you allow the Spirit to empower you in your ministry to make Jesus's last command your first priority? God bless you guys.